Well, I think we're good now, yeah? Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Uwe. My wife, Madonna, just walked out with two of our daughters. We attended this church here for a couple of years, about 3 years ago, and moved to Taitung 3 years ago. And hey, are just back every once in a while, but it's so nice to always be back. Our little church in Taitung, we go to a small English service there. We have about 20 to 30 people every time. And so it's so nice to worship in a bigger crowd with all of you. We do have two baptisms today, so we're sorry to miss that in Taitung. But it's really, really nice to be here. So thanks for welcoming us. Um, I do have Legos, but that's just to make a point. I had to wait till my daughter left before I brought them up because she would have been really upset. So I'm just going to set them here for now. And we're gonna look at really quickly what we do. My wife and I work with a nonprofit now called Taiwan Sunshine. So we work with families in Taiwan that have kids with special needs. We support and encourage the families. We found in Taiwan there's so much going on with education, pretty good special education, very good medical, good therapy as well. But the piece that is missing that we found again and again and again is the support that Taiwanese families have in their marriages and their relationships, the relationships with the other siblings, the relationships with their mother-in-law. If any of you have a Taiwanese mother-in-law, 加油啊, huh? And I was born and grew up in Taiwan, so I speak a little bit more freely about Taiwanese culture, so forgive me. But we're really seeing that more and more. We're sliding into that more and more. And so just dealing a lot more with counseling issues and family issues. And those of you who know me know I'm not a very emotional guy, and I'm also German. And so sometimes, like I'm German, not German American, it's a little bit awkward to bring up and talk about some of these issues. And so a couple of weeks ago, actually this past week in my devotions, I was reading through the book of First Samuel and got to Hannah's prayer, the story of Hannah, the story of Samuel, and I had to stop. And I had to look at that story again and again and again. I've not moved past it yet. And so I shared it a little bit last Sunday at our church in Taitung. And I thought, I just have to dig into this a little bit more. It doesn't have the full title up there because I forgot to add the extra 3 words. I'm not much of a PowerPoint guy, but I'm really stretching myself. I have some pictures on my PowerPoint today. But it's Hannah's prayer, grief or sorrow and joy. And what I think this story does so well is it tells us that so many, or we make an assumption sometimes that we have to stop having sorrow and grief and live a life of joy. And we do, we want to. But I think sometimes as Christians, we kind of say, well, you got to move out of the sorrow and the joy into sorrow and the grief and into the joy. And I want to propose to you that the world we currently live in, I'm not talking about politics and any of that stuff, okay? That's all temporary. But the state of the world that we currently live in allows us to have both sorrow and joy, at the same time. And so that, I think, is what this story of Hannah does, and is just an amazing thing. I want to give you 2 little frameworks. I used to be a teacher, so I wish there was a big whiteboard here. Actually, I wish there was a whiteboard all the way around because we'd start on one end and fill it in all the way around. But we can't do that. But I want to give you just 2 frameworks that help me. And as we look at stories from the Old Testament, there's a little image I put up. Pretty proud of myself for that. Usually it's just like one word. These are 2 frameworks that I want to show you that I think we can plug the stories from the Bible onto. You want to go a little bit deeper, we can plug our theological ideas and frameworks onto that, okay? And so this first one here, and I'll pull this together to the story of Hannah too, is that I think we were created with 4 primary relationships. In fact, all of our life is about these 4 relationships. You work a lot in the Chinese cultural setting. Confucius only took care of the second one. He didn't get the other ones. So I'm one up on Confucius. No. And so the first relationship that we have, of course, all of us, is we have a relationship to God. We have a relationship to ourselves. So the relationship to God is our spiritual life. The relationship to ourselves is our physical bodies and also our social and emotional well-being. Our relationship to others, so that's interpersonal relationships, but also relationships between groups of people, even between countries. It all fits into that. And finally, I say the word creation. If I'm in a non-Christian setting, I talk about the universe or our environment. But here we'll say creation. We have a relationship to our creation as well, how we use things. I love coffee. I like good breakfasts. And so that's a relationship I have with this creation. I love this creation. I love putting it inside me. Okay, let's go to the next framework. This is going downhill. My wife's already cringing over there. So second framework, kind of a skeleton that I want to just present to you and then plug Hannah's story into is this. Now, it says God's plan. Sometimes people are really worried that you can so strongly say what God's plan is. Well, the Bible tells us that God doesn't hide anything from us. He reveals his plan to his people. And so the four major components of the Bible here, sorry it's a little bit small, the four main themes of the Bible are, of course, creation, fall, redemption, and fulfillment, which ends in the fullness of God's glory filling the entire creation again, okay? And so if you were to overlap those two, you know that the two frameworks during creation, our relationship with God was perfect, to ourselves was perfect, to others was perfect, and to creation was perfect. I don't have time to unpack all of that. During the fall, all four of those relationships were completely severed. Because of redemption, Jesus dying on the cross, that's why we say the cross is the central part. It's the thing that everything shifts on. Jesus is the rock and the cornerstone. This is it. Because everything changes on that bottom little dip. Please don't be caught up with like up, down, and distances. I'm not an artist. And so everything changes there, and everything can be restored to the way God wanted it to be again. We live in that process from number 3 to 4, where it says reconciliation, where God has started by bringing his kingdom on earth to reconcile things to himself again. It's not fully completed until Christ returns. Everything is fulfilled. Everything is perfect again. So in a nutshell, everything was perfect. Everything got broken. Everything can be fixed. Everything will be perfect. Middle school, high schoolers, whoever got stuck here, that's it right there. If you want to know what the Bible's about, everything was perfect. Everything got broken. Everything can be fixed. Everything will be fixed. And that's it right there. And so what we need to do when we look at stories from the Old Testament, and I grew up in a very traditional German home. My parents were missionaries here in Taiwan, so I was born and raised here. And so sometimes when people become missionaries, they leave their home country and just so badly want to make sure that their kids don't lose that Germanness. You know, I have a friend in the corner there who always makes fun of my not really being a true German. He's probably a little bit right about that. But I grew up in a very, very traditional German home because my parents wanted to make sure that I stayed German and wouldn't become American. They didn't want... I'll let you be the judge of what happened. But the German background that I come from, is a very proper and rules-oriented background. And so there's always a danger when you come from some of those cultures. There's something that's fantastic about each culture, and there's something the Lord needs to redeem in each culture too. And that's the polite way to say this. So my German background, focusing on you have to do the right thing. You have to obey all the rules. You've got to just like do it right. And I think that sometimes that slips into the way I look at the Bible. And I actually think that has also slipped in how we teach Sunday school. Now, I've done youth groups a long time. I've taught unsuccessfully younger kids in Sunday schools. But I do think that we sometimes see the Old Testament stories as a moralistic fable. They're fables. In the German culture, the children's stories are horrible. You should read them sometime. It's just gruesome. Hansel and Gretel is a horrible story of kids being abandoned in the forest because the parents don't want to die, so let the kids die instead. And so we take those are fables. And so the stories in the Old Testament are not moralistic fables. We don't want to look at the stories in the Old Testament and say, oh, we should be more like David. We should be more like Daniel. We should be more like Ruth. We should be more like Samson. We should be more like Rahab. No, we should be more like, okay? So this is not what the point of the stories in the Old Testament are. Of course there are biblical principles in those stories. Of course there are parts of the lives of these people that honored the Lord and what he wanted them to do. Let's identify, let's pull them out, but let's not look at stories in the Old Testament with the idea, oh, I have to be like that. I have to be like that. I have to be like that. The opposite of the story, okay? It's actually goes completely against that. And so I give you these two frameworks. That's a long introduction. To get to the story of Hannah. And so go ahead and change the slide. I'm already off my notes. We'll leave that one up for a bit, but I just want to set the cultural context for you here. And so what we do need to understand is the idea that the Old Testament, in a nutshell, says Jesus is coming. New Testament says Jesus came and he's coming again. Again, that's 3 sentences, the whole Bible. Jesus is coming, Jesus came, he's coming again. Those 3 sentences are the whole Bible in another nutshell. Germans have a lot of nutshells to put things in to keep it simple for us, okay? And so we need to look at these stories and think, okay, how does this story tell me that God already is starting to fix things? You know, as soon as Adam and Eve sinned, as soon as they got kicked out of the garden, God said, hey, this is bad. I'm going to start fixing things right away. And so he prepares the Messiah to come. So I want you to look at this story. I want you to look at stories in the Old Testament. Don't throw out the good principles, not at all. But think of it in the context of, how does this tell me Jesus is coming? So we're in the book of Judges. Okay, we're right starting at the beginning. Samuel starts right at the end of the book of Judges. And what happens is the people always forget God. They always do their own thing. And so God always brings a person along. And it's interesting, the judges, we call them the judges, but really the reason they became a judge is because they were a redeemer first. Okay? Because they were oppressed by other people, God raises up a judge, they fight, he saves them through that judge, through the leadership of that judge, and then that judge sticks around for a while, and then it kind of goes downhill from there. Okay? And then another people group comes in, and so the judge is always a redeemer first and then a judge. It didn't work. I mean, I think you would agree with me, yeah. There were good parts in the stories, but it just didn't work. Putting a person in as a redeemer and a judge didn't work. What's God doing? He says, wait, someone's coming. Wait, someone's coming. Okay, and so now we get to the book of Samuel. And Samuel is kind of right at the end of this. Samuel judges too, but Samuel is really the transition from the judges to the kings. Because Samuel is the one who anoints Saul. Samuel's also the one who anoints David. And so Samuel is that transition piece between redeemer judges that doesn't work to kings. The people all think, well, maybe this will work. Maybe this will make us great. We look back on it and we're like, no, those kings didn't work either. So I think what God is saying here is, yeah, the redeemer judge didn't work. Yeah, the king didn't work. It's not going to work. You know, because God said, hey, are you guys sure you want to do this? Are you sure you want kings? And the people are like, yeah, we want kings. And God's like, no, don't. And they said, yes, we will, stubborn. And God said, okay, and then this is what happened. So again, God's saying, hey, that didn't work either, but just wait, because I am in the process of fixing everything. The book of Judges ends with a horrible story. I like these stories, sorry. But the Benjamites were punished, and then the men had no more women to marry. And they didn't want to just completely exterminate the tribe. This is the time of Judges. It says everybody did as was fit in their own mind. So these are horrible stories, okay? And so the Benjamites, the people finally said, oh, no, we shouldn't kill off one of the tribes. But now we don't have any women for these men to marry. But we also said, cursed is whoever gives them a wife. You know, so we're not going to let our daughters marry these men. This is right at the end, guys. This is a true story of the book of Judges. And they said, here's what we'll do. We're going to go to Shiloh. And I tell you the story because Shiloh is where the next part picks up. Let's pull Ruth out because Ruth is kind of just a nice story in the middle. Pull that out historically, and it flows. We're going to go to Shiloh. And every year there's a festival in Shiloh. And what we're going to do is we're going to tell the Benjamites, the young men, to kind of be in hiding. And when the young girls come out to dance, just run in and kidnap one. And it's okay because we can tell the fathers of those daughters who are afraid they're going to get punished, don't worry, they got kidnapped. You didn't give them to the Benjamites. And so that's how the story ends. Just terrible kidnapping among God's people to make sure that this tribe doesn't get exterminated. And so this happened in Shiloh. And so this is where our story starts again. Now, we're going to do today a little bit like a story. And so I'll go through it a little bit. I'll tell a little bit of a story. I'll try to get some practical applications for you. We're going to look at these two prayers. I'm not going to get into too much detail of the second prayer because I want to encourage you to go back home, read through Hannah's actually kind of her third prayer, but I put the second and third one together, to read through it yourself with the idea, with the anticipation God's doing something. It's not finished yet. We're seeing the start, but he's doing more. Okay, so please, that'll be your homework as you leave here. But here's the story that we have. And so there's a man, his name is Elkanah. And Elkanah is a good and godly man. Because every year we know that Elkanah goes to Shiloh, which is where Eli was the priest with his two horrible sons who did horrible things. But he was the priest there. And so Elkanah is a good and godly man. He he leads his family spiritually, which is not something that was typical at the time. And every year he would take his family to Shiloh to make a sacrifice. And Elkanah had two wives. Now, young men, just because the Bible describes something, actually everybody, just because the Bible describes something does not mean that God desires that, okay? A description is not a prescription, and not even is not a prescription, is sometimes completely against what God desires. So as you read through all these stories in the Old Testament, yeah, I want to have a heart like David, but I don't want to be like David, you know? And so these are things that, yes, they're cultural, but I think it's where people gave in to culture instead of staying with what God had designed in the first place. And so he had two wives, and one of his wives' name was Peninnah, and she had a lot of kids. And his other wife's name was Hannah, and she didn't have any kids. And like today, back then, if you couldn't have any children, you were looked on as there's something wrong with you. There is something wrong. You have done something wrong. Your value isn't complete because you have not been able to provide children, not just for your husband, but for your whole family. Some of you, maybe one or two of you, live in a pocket of some culture where it's no big deal. But I think the rest of us still live in a culture where we still see that as something like, ooh, that's too bad. Or some of us say, oh, that's terrible. And some of us in our cultures, it's like, wow, you really must have done something terrible. And so that's the situation that we're in. And so year after year, Elkanah takes his whole family to Shiloh. They sacrifice there. And Hannah goes with him. And in verse 6 of 1 Samuel, it says, and because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. Can you go back a slide, please? I want to go back something. Okay? And so this is actually a very, very hard verse. This verse to me is as hard as Exodus 4:11 when Moses is arguing with God and God said, isn't that I who makes man speak and I who makes him dumb? So isn't that I who brings this about? Because these are hard verses for us in the Bible. Because we say, how could God close someone's womb? How could God make someone have a disability? How can that be? Now, I don't understand it fully, okay? So I'm not here to offer the answer. I've read, because of our line of work, I've tried to read up on some of this stuff. But what we come down to is back to this diagram. And I wish it was a little closer, but you just have to imagine with me, okay? That upward line, from 1 to 2, everything was perfect. There was no such thing as suffering. There was no such thing as grief. There's no such thing as death. When you jump over to 4 and go on forever, there should be an arrow on the back of that, there is no such thing as suffering. There's no such thing as death. That isn't there. But from 2 to 3 to 4, the reality is that the world we currently live in is not normal. Okay? So we live currently in an unnormal state of the world. The way God created it is His normal. But we're currently in this unnormal state of the world. In an unnormal state of the world, it is normal for there to be suffering, for there to be death, for there to be disability, for there to be brokenness, for there to be grief and sorrow. That is something that in the world where we are right now, and we're somewhere between 2 and 3, and I hope we're 3 and 4. I hope we're closer to 4, but we could just be like a tiny inch above above 3 too. I don't know. It's not for us to know that. But in this world, it is normal that these things would be. It's normal that Hannah wasn't able to have a child. Um, it's normal that my daughter is born with a disability. This is normal in a broken world. But like I said before, God is starting to change things through his church, bringing the kingdom on earth, and he's going to change things completely. And so in this little dip, this is what happens. This is the world that we live in. This is the reality. Why does God do that? I don't know. But he's fixing and changing everything. And so God closed her womb, it says, and her rival provoked her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year after year. And whenever Hannah went to the house of the Lord, until she wept, this went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. And so this, I don't think we can understand the amount of grief and suffering that Hannah went through. I think it's really hard for us to understand that. But constantly being reminded. I'm sure when Penina had another child, first person she showed was Hannah. Say, hey, look, another one. I'm sure there was a lot of anger in Penina's heart because the Bible later tells us that when they went to the temple, Elkanah gave a double portion to Hannah because he loved her. You think Penina didn't know that he didn't love her? You know, and so just the family situation of Elkanah and Penina and Hannah is just a terrible, terrible, terrible family situation. And Hannah, in that situation, is just overcome with that grief and that sorrow and just doesn't know what to do. Now, gentlemen, if you forget everything else I say, you got to hear this next verse. Because Elkanah, as a good man, has an amazing response to his wife's grief. Okay? Here's what he says. Gentlemen, you have to listen to this, okay? Elkanah, as a good man, has a perfect response to his wife's grief. He says, look, honey, I don't know why you're sad. You got me. I mean, just look at this, you know? I mean, with all of this, why? What's your problem? I mean, can't I give you more joy than 10 sons? Right? And so this is Elkanah's response. Come on. Not that big a deal. You got me after all. If you don't believe me, here's what he says. Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Okay, so this says, gentlemen, if you forget everything else, don't say this to your wife. Okay? And so we go on, and Hannah, in her bitterness of soul, wept much and prayed to the Lord. And so we get into Hannah's first prayer here, in this despair, and she's pleading with God. She's asking God, would you please do something about this? Now, what you'll notice here in the first part of this prayer, I mean, it's a very typical prayer. If you, then this, okay? In fact, the covenant that God made with his people on Mount Sinai was an if you, then I, okay? It was not a covenant of grace. The covenant of grace says, I will, and that stops right there. The Sinai covenant says, if you, then I, okay? And so there's conditional statements still at play here. And so Hannah prays like this too. And you know what struck me? It says, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me and not forget your servant, but give her a son. Then I'll give him to you. He'll be a Nazarene, won't cut his hair, he'll be dedicated to the Lord. But you know what jumps out at me here, and I italicize these things, if you will only look on, if you will remember, if you will not forget. You see, the core of Hannah's misery, yeah, she was barren. Yes, she had a terrible, what would you call that, a co-wife? But a terrible, there's this abuse in the family as well. She had a husband who didn't understand, an arrogant husband who didn't understand. But at the core of this prayer, do you notice what the issue is here? It's an issue of loneliness and isolation, isn't it? If you would just please look on your servant's misery. Can you just have a look at me and what I'm going through? If you would please remember me, if you would not forget your servant, but give her a son. And so that's really it. And this is what I have my little Lego illustration for here. And like I said, I had to wait until Matea was gone. She gets very upset when I steal her toys. And I somehow have gotten into doing a lot of parenting and marriage seminars. I don't know why, but God works in mysterious ways. And so one of the things that I do a lot to explain, actually I explain this to teachers too, is so often we have this person, it's a female, so we'll make this the mom, and she works at the Taipei Zoo. Um, and specifically in regards to the suffering and grief that comes with having a child with special needs, which is tremendous, tremendous in Taiwan. We have so many families that we talk to, Taiwanese families who just don't know what to do next. We had one family, the dad for 4 years has every day on his way home to work, on his way home from work, has said, if I just end it, everything's going to be better. He finally started talking to a counselor, talked with the wife too, and you know what she said? She said, me too. And just the overwhelming sense of grief. They have a child with autism, and then they have twins who are just the cutest little things. You know, we said, hey, come to one of our date nights first. Just take some time for yourself. We'll watch your kids. They're a little bit more difficult, but that's okay. I mean, that's what kids are supposed to be like, right? And now have agreed to actually come to in 2 weeks we have a retreat for 10 families that have kids with special needs in Taitung. And it was just overwhelming to me that they felt so isolated for years, every day. They've wanted to end this. And anyway, so what we do is we talk about how when we take our kids out to the park, right? So let's say you have a child with special needs, autism, whatever it is. You're going out to the park, you're trying to meet people, and everybody stares at you and says, hey, what's wrong with your kid? And then they might be in a stroller or a wheelchair, and these grandmas come up and say, hey, they mean well, they love you, that's why they say it to you. But these Taiwanese grandmas come up and say, hey, how come your kid isn't walking? What do you put him in a wheelchair for? If you actually made them walk, you know they would be stronger. And you're like, ha, 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 okay, thanks. You go to the store, and your child rips things off the shelves, throws them on the ground. You're desperately trying to control the meltdown, put the stuff back. You just want to walk away, without the child. But you should take the child. And so what happens is that you go to church sometimes. Thank God, not here. But you go to church sometimes, and the Sunday school teacher comes to you and says, hey, actually, we can't handle kids like this in our Sunday school. And you're like, oh, I'm sorry. And you take your whole kid and you take your whole family and you head home. And then family reunions. You're not really sure if you can really keep your job up because of all the stresses at home. And basically, I explained to her, and they're like nodding, nodding, nodding. And basically, I explained to our parents, here's what we're doing. Every time we have a negative experience, we kind of build a little bit more of a wall, don't we? We build a little bit more of a wall. And you know where we are? We're on the inside. I shared this with a stroke survivor group, and this one guy was totally tracking with me. I said, what's this? He goes, it's a castle. I said, where are you? He says, I'm on the inside. I said, what about that? He goes, that's not good. That's not good. And so we need to make, we have to understand that the loneliness, whether it's in our own life or in the lives of friends, every experience, everything, it's easy to build that wall. One of the hardest things to do is to start breaking down a wall. And so we talk, as we talk with these families, we're trying to break this wall down. And it's not that easy to come out again. It takes so much work to get some kids ready just to get out of the house, right? And so parents are like, forget it. I just won't do it. But we have to make that effort in our lives, but also in your life if you're feeling this way. And if you see friends like that, just say, no, it's actually not okay to keep building this up. There's 2 verses I want to share with you. And they were so encouraging. And I wish that Hannah would have just heard these verses right away. One's from Isaiah 49. And some of you know this. And God's talking to his people Israel there. And it's this incredible love that God has for his people Israel. And in Isaiah 49:15, here's what he says. He says, and I can't even imagine this front part being true, but God says, even if a mother were to forget her child, and I was like, whoa, how could that even be? But even if a mother were to forget her child, here's what God says. Can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child she has born? Though she may forget, so even if she does forget, I will not forget you. See, it says, see, I have engraved you on the palms of my hand. And then in Hebrews 13, context is not being overcome with the love of money, but the writer of Hebrews quotes from Deuteronomy, and it's the same message. God says, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. I mean, wouldn't it have been so amazing if Hannah could have heard that right there, right now? Wouldn't it be so amazing if we could hear that right now if we're praying these prayers of just total loneliness, total grief, feeling completely isolated, knowing that we shouldn't build up these walls, knowing that we shouldn't do any of this, but we just do because we just need to survive. And then as a church, I want to ask you, what's your role in that when you have friends like that, when you have people in your community like that? What's your role in that? And I don't know the answer to that, but ask God and ask Him to please show you how you can do that. Prayer goes on. I'll give them to the Lord. Okay? And so if that happens. Now, we know from the story, and this is a prayer that, if we go back to our diagram, happens in the brokenness of this world. Okay? This is a prayer of brokenness in this world. All right? Let's go on here in my story. Don't turn to the next. Oh, I told people I'd be 25 minutes. It'll be a little bit longer. Hold on, guys. And so what happens, because this is where now the church comes in. We've had the husband come into play. Now we're going to let the church, so to say, come into play in this story, okay? And so she prays this, and she kept on praying to the Lord. This is verse 12. Eli, who is the high priest, okay, I know this is not a temple. I know there's no high priest here, okay? But this is the worship center in Shiloh, okay? This is the worship. Churches are the worship centers for us here and now. And so Eli observed her mouth. I mean, first of all, what's he standing there looking at the woman praying for? Anyway, okay? But he does. And he's observing her mouth, and in her heart she's praying, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk. And he said to her, what are you doing? Why do you keep, how long? Not only drunk, but an alcoholic. Okay, so not just one too many, but like, why do you keep getting drunk? Get rid of your wine. And so Hannah, of course, I mean, imagine this, like you're praying, you're trembling, you're crying, your lips are moving, you're completely overcome with grief and emotion, you're in the house of God. You think this is the only person who hears you because your husband certainly doesn't hear you, and the other woman certainly is always making fun of you, and the community's kind of shuns you because you can't do anything right. You're in the one place where you think someone's listening, and you kind of get jolted out of your prayer, and it's like, hey, you drunk lady, what are you doing? Get out of here. How dare you come into the house of God and be completely drunk like this? And she's, obviously wants to defend herself. She says, oh, I'm the woman who's deeply troubled. I'm not drunk. Believe me. And he's like, yeah, believe me, I am not drunk. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. I wonder if sometimes as a Christian, I want people to get their act together first before they come to the Lord. You ever wondered that? Is the message sometimes in our small groups or in our communities, hey, I'm going to help you get your act together, or not, or you've got to do this until you take ownership of the problem. There's all these great terms, and I understand that from a counseling perspective. Actually, I don't really, but I get it from a counseling perspective, and that's necessary. But I wonder if sometimes as a Christian, I expect people to kind of get it together. And when you get it together, come on, you're welcome to fellowship with us. But struggling with that a bit, maybe kind of keep it to yourself, and then, when you're ready, come on in. We want to welcome you when you're ready. I'm assuming a lot on Eli here, okay? But I'm not sure I wouldn't have reacted in the same way. I'm really not sure that I would not have reacted in the same way. And that to me is a very, very sobering thought, that when someone is in God's house pouring out their heart because no one else is listening, feeling completely isolated and alone. I mean, I wonder if that's how I approach these things too, okay? Now, Eli says, the Lord's heard you. She goes back. I got to speed this up a bit. She goes back. She has a son. Again, Elkanah takes his family to Shiloh every year. But Hannah now says, okay, you know what? I'm going to wait just a little bit. I actually honestly think there wasn't anything like deep and spiritual. I think she didn't want her son to go. I think that, she says, oh, we'll wait until he's weaned, and then all the commentaries say all sorts of stuff about that. I think she just wanted to keep her son with her just a little bit longer. And so she does that, so she doesn't go with him. And then when the time comes, because as Hannah did not go with them, and her husband says, that's okay. There's a little change of heart there. That's okay, you can do that. And so after he's weaned, whatever age that is, it really doesn't matter what age that is, they brought him to Shiloh, and then he stayed at Shiloh. And so we get now to Hannah's second prayer. And I should have included the last couple of verses. And it says this, I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life, he will be given over to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. And so that's technically the second one. But let's go to the what I lumped it together with the other one. And so Hannah's second prayer, and she goes through this. And I'm going to ask you to read through this by yourself, and just really with the thought in mind that this is a prayer of contrast. Here's this, but God. Here's this, but now. This is what happens, but here's what's going to happen. Okay? Like this now, but. This now, but. This is typical, but. This is typical, but. I want you to read through that, maybe just quietly sometime. It's only 10 verses. It's not very much. Just to look at it. I won't unpack it much here. I want to pull my thoughts together. I'll read it out loud for you here, and then you could switch slides when I get to the end. My heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord my horn is lifted high. Her heart was still grieving. If you give up your son, you're still grieving. Okay? My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance. Okay? Our enemies possibly were that other woman in the house. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you. There is no rock like our God. Do not keep talking so proudly, or let your mouth speak such arrogance. For the Lord is a God who knows, and by him deeds are weighed. The bows of the warriors are broken, but those who stumbled are armed with strength. Those who were full hire themselves out for food, but those who are hungry no more. She who was barren has borne 7 children, but she who has had many sons pines away. That means she's really sad. The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and he raises up. The Lord sends poverty and wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes. He has them inherit a throne of honor. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's. On them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful servants. But the wicked will be silenced in the place of darkness. It is not by strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be broken. The Most High will thunder from heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. And this is an amazing prophecy. She's praying this prayer when there were no kings in Israel. Okay? He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. And that's her prayer. That's a prayer that describes that God is redeeming, that God is reconciling, and that God is eventually fulfilling all of his creation and restoring all of his creation back to himself so that his glory will fill the entire earth again. That's where God's going, to restore the earth so that his glory will fill it completely. I want to pull my thoughts together. I think, and I hope you see this, the idea that as Christians today, we still live in a broken world. And that we don't need to put this pressure on ourselves to try to fix our grief and just get over it. Because unless we just get over it, we can't really experience the full joy and power of the Lord. That's a bunch of rubbish. The Bible never says any of that, okay? And so I want to encourage you that in this world that we live in, we can have grief and sorrow and joy at the same time. Why? Because God is in the process of redeeming and restoring everything back to himself again. And so while we're still here, grief and joy are going to go hand in hand. And as you see that in the lives of your friends and people here in this church, just encourage them and just say, hey, it's okay. Let's not downplay the grief. Let's not get over the grief. Some grief you never get over. But let's acknowledge that God isn't done with you or with this world yet. And he's going to take all that and he's going to change all that. He's going to turn it into something beautiful. We never hear about Hannah again. But we know what Samuel did. I mean, Samuel was a man of God who called the priest on the behavior of him and his sons, who then anointed the first king, and then while the first king was still king, went and anointed the second king, and was just this man that spoke the word of God to the people of Israel. Okay? But I know that whole time when Samuel, I don't know, but I'm convinced that whole time Samuel was growing up in the temple, his mom was sad, his mom was grieving, and also overjoyed because she knew that God is restoring things to himself. I want to put this next poem up. It's actually an old song. I won't sing, don't worry. And if the music guys want to come up, you guys go ahead and get ready. I know it takes you a moment to get everything together. But this poem here is by Annie J. Flint. And the story goes that she had this terrible, terrible case of rheumatoid arthritis. And she's an old songwriter. This is actually an old hymn. It's a little bit hard to sing. But that's not the only reason I'm not singing it. But she, at the end of her life, was so disfigured and from rheumatism that she had to have 8 pillows just to support her body in her bed. The author of her biography says that she was completely covered in boils too. And so you have this woman who, in just horrible suffering and grief and sorrow, was able to write a song like this. Also, she was an orphan. I forgot that part of the story, okay? So all of this, and these are the words that she writes. Sorry, I'm going to read them, and then you guys are on. And then here's what she says. He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength.
He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. To added afflictions he addeth his mercy. To multiplied trials his multiplied peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed, ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving is only begun. His love has no limits. His grace has no measure. His power no boundary known unto men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus, he giveth and giveth and giveth again.
Amen. All right, I want you guys. Thanks, everybody.